The atmosphere within the House of Representatives is rarely electric, often devolving into the mundane procedural drone of legislative bureaucracy. Yet the events surrounding the censure of Adam Schiff pierced that veil of normalcy with a sharpness that demands forensic attention. Representatives Harriet Hageman and Anna Paulina Luna took to the floor not merely to voice a grievance, but to initiate a procedural condemnation that is historically scarce and politically potent. When they approached the podium, the gravity of their intent was clear, signaling a shift from standard partisan bickering to a formal indictment of institutional conduct. They were not simply arguing against a policy difference. They were leveling a direct accusation against the former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee regarding his fundamental fitness for office. This was a calculated, strategic move designed to put the entire chamber on record regarding the integrity of the oversight mechanisms that govern the nation's intelligence apparatus. The core of their argument rests on the assertion that Adam Schiff weaponized the unique privileges of his station, specifically his access to high-level security clearances, to manufacture a narrative that the American public had no means to independently verify at the time. In the world of intelligence oversight, the disparity in information between the committee members and the general populace is vast, creating a fiduciary relationship that relies entirely on the honesty of the elected official. Hageman and Luna argued that this sacred trust was violated, suggesting that the specialized knowledge claimed by Schiff was a facade used to prop up the allegations of Russian collusion during the 2016 election cycle. By positioning himself as the holder of damning evidence that could not be shared due to classification, Schiff effectively insulated his claims from immediate scrutiny, a tactic the two congresswomen described as a deliberate manipulation of the system. This accusation of a network of lies is not merely rhetorical hyperbole, but refers to specific instances where the public narrative diverged from the classified reality that was later illuminated by declassified documents and Inspector General reports. The representatives contend that the dissonance between what was said in television studios and what was known inside the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, or SCIF, constitutes a breach of ethical standards warranting formal reprimand. They argue that the extensive media circuit undertaken by the former chairman created a feedback loop of misinformation, where intelligence assertions were treated as confirmed facts before the investigative dust had settled. From an analytical standpoint, this highlights a critical vulnerability in how intelligence is communicated to the electorate, where the authority of the speaker often outweighs the verifiable evidence available in the public domain. The financial dimension of their argument introduces a tangible metric to what might otherwise be an abstract debate about ethics and truth, grounding their grievance in the verifiable expenditure of taxpayer resources. The figure of $32 million is cited not just as a line item in a budget, but as the cost of an investigation that Hageman and Luna assert was predicated on a faulty premise from its inception. This sum represents the direct costs associated with the special counsel investigation led by Robert Mueller, an inquiry that dominated the American political landscape for nearly 2 years. By attaching this price tag to their censure resolution, the representatives are effectively arguing that the opportunity cost of this investigation was not just monetary, but a diversion of governmental bandwidth that could have been applied to pressing domestic issues. We must objectively analyze the implications of citing this $32 million figure, as it serves to weaponize the concept of fiscal responsibility against the backdrop of political investigation. In the eyes of the censure's proponents, this expenditure constitutes a fraudulent waste because, in their view, the genesis of the investigation was poisoned by political opposition research masquerading as intelligence. They draw a direct line between the dossier-fueled warrants and the subsequent sprawling investigation, suggesting that without the initial amplification of these unverified claims by figures like Schiff, the cost to the taxpayer would have been null. This argument resonates deeply with a constituency skeptical of federal spending, framing the investigation not as a pursuit of justice, but as a publicly funded political operation designed to cripple an administration. The allegations regarding the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, represent perhaps the most technically dense but legally significant portion of the censure resolution presented by the Congresswomen. The FISA court operates in secrecy, an arrangement designed to protect national security but one that requires absolute candor from the officials submitting warrant applications. Hageman and Luna pointed to the findings of the Department of Justice Inspector General, which identified 17 significant errors and omissions in the applications to surveil Carter Page. They argue that Schiff, in his capacity as the ranking member and later chairman, vigorously defended these applications and released memos countering the concerns raised by his Republican counterparts, concerns that were later vindicated by the Inspector General's report. This specific charge regarding FISA abuse moves the conversation beyond general political rhetoric and into the realm of legal accountability and procedural integrity within the Department of Justice and the legislative branch. The representatives contend that by championing the integrity of flawed warrant applications, the former chairman provided political cover for institutional overreach that infringed upon the civil liberties of American citizens. It raises a profound question about the responsibility of oversight committees. Is their duty to defend the intelligence agencies or to skepticism them on behalf of the citizenry? The argument laid out on the House floor suggests that in this instance, the oversight function was inverted, with the committee leadership acting as advocates for a flawed process rather than as the check and balance the Constitution envisions. By framing Schiff's actions as a betrayal of public trust, Luna and Hageman are invoking a standard that transcends simple legislative disagreement, aiming to categorize the behavior as a violation of the oath of office itself. This rhetorical escalation is designed to categorize the events not as a difference of opinion regarding the Russia investigation, but as a deliberate deception perpetrated against the sovereign masters of the government, the voters. They describe a scenario where the division within the country was not an organic byproduct of a contentious election, but an engineered outcome fueled by a narrative that the proponents knew to be exaggerated or false. This perspective treats the polarization of the last several years as a manufactured condition, with the censure serving as the mechanism to identify the architect. The assertion that these actions were taken to weaken a sitting president speaks to the strategic undercurrent of the censure, acknowledging the fierce power struggle that defined the executive-legislative relationship during the Trump administration. From a neutral analytical perspective, it is undeniable that the investigations and the surrounding media narratives severely hampered the administration's ability to enact its agenda and depleted its political capital. The representatives argue that this was the primary objective all along, utilizing the veneer of national security concerns to execute a political strategy of containment and delegitimization. By labeling this as an illegitimate pursuit of political advantage, they are attempting to strip the investigations of their legal nobility and recategorize them as partisan warfare. Furthermore, the focus on the fraudulent use of FISA warrants serves as a critical pivot point in the argument, linking the actions of individual politicians to systemic failures within the federal law enforcement apparatus. It suggests a symbiosis between political actors in Congress and career officials in the agencies, a relationship that the censure proponents argue was weaponized against a specific political target. This aligns with broader criticisms regarding the deep state, though the resolution itself sticks to the procedural facts of the warrant applications and the public defense of those warrants. The implication is that without the cover provided by high-ranking congressional figures, the errors in the FISA process might have been exposed and corrected much earlier. The call for accountability is framed by Hageman and Luna as a moral obligation, a phrase that seeks to elevate the vote from a partisan headcount to a matter of conscience for every member of the House. They are positing that the integrity of the institution is inextricably linked to its willingness to police its own members, regardless of their stature or tenure. If the House refuses to address what they characterize as proven falsehoods and abuses of power, They argue that the body implicitly endorses such conduct, thereby lowering the bar for future leadership. This argument places pressure on moderate members of the opposition party and institutionalists who might otherwise shy away from such a confrontational measure. We must also consider the timing and the context of this censure motion, coming as it does in a polarized environment where retrospective analysis of the 2016 and 2020 eras is still a dominant political force. The representatives are not merely looking backward. They are setting a precedent for how the House will deal with the weaponization of classified information in the future. By demanding a formal reprimand, they are attempting to establish a deterrent against the use of Intelligence Committee privileges for political narratives. It is a assertion that the speech and debate clause of the Constitution, which protects legislators from legal liability for what they say on the floor, does not immunize them from the internal judgment of their peers regarding the truthfulness of their statements. The invocation of restoring the integrity and credibility of the United States Congress is the closing argument of their presentation, suggesting that the institution is currently in a state of disrepair due to these past actions. This speaks to a crisis of confidence that is reflected in polling data regarding public trust in government, which remains at historic lows. Hageman and Luna are positioning the censure of Adam Schiff as a necessary step in a long rehabilitation process for the legislature. They argue that until the record is corrected and the responsible parties are named, the cloud of the Russia collusion narrative will continue to obscure the legitimate work of Congress. In analyzing the accusation of collusion with Russia, it is essential to parse the distinction made by the representatives between legitimate inquiry and the propagation of a lie. They do not necessarily argue that Russia did not attempt to interfere, but rather that the specific allegation of a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin was a fabrication sustained by Schiff's rhetoric. They point to the lack of criminally actionable evidence of such a conspiracy in the final Mueller report as vindication of their stance. The lie, in their formulation, was the certainty with which Schiff spoke of more than circumstantial evidence in public forums, a level of certainty that was never corroborated by the legal filings of the special counsel. The wasted $32 million argument also serves as a potent symbol of the opportunity costs incurred by the nation during the years of intense investigation and litigation. It invites the public to imagine what that funding could have achieved if directed toward infrastructure, healthcare, or border security, thereby making the abstract political fight tangible to the average taxpayer. This rhetorical device is effective because it bypasses the complex legal arguments about FISA and collusion, appealing directly to the wallet of the voter. It paints the picture of a government that is not only deceptive but also profligate, burning through resources to chase phantoms while real-world problems go unaddressed. Ultimately, the speeches by Hageman and Luna paint a portrait of a political operation that went off the rails, shielded by the veil of national security and funded by the very people it deceived. They argue that the network of lies was not an accidental byproduct of a chaotic time, but a constructed reality designed to gaslight the American public. The censure resolution is presented as the tool to dismantle this structure, a formal declaration that the House of Representatives acknowledges the deception. It is a clash of narratives that will define the historical record of the era, with the censure vote serving as the final verdict on who controlled the truth during one of the most turbulent periods in American politics. To fully comprehend the magnitude of the allegations leveled by Representatives Hageman and Luna, one must dissect the specific mechanisms of information warfare that they claim Adam Schiff employed, particularly regarding the infamous Steele dossier. This collection of unverified memos, authored by former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele, served as the nucleus for much of the collusion narrative, yet its provenance was rooted in partisan opposition research funded by the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign. The core of the censure argument is not merely that the dossier was flawed, but that Schiff, utilizing the imprimatur of the House Intelligence Committee, treated these raw, uncorroborated allegations as actionable intelligence worthy of the highest classification. By doing so, he effectively laundered political dirt through the sterile, trusted channels of national security, granting it a legitimacy it could never have achieved on its own merits. This transmutation of paid political research into intelligence represents a fundamental breach of the analytical firewall that is supposed to separate campaign tactics from national security assessments. The controversy surrounding the Nunes memo serves as a critical historical pivot point in this saga, illustrating the stark divergence between the narratives presented by Schiff and the eventual findings of the Department of Justice Inspector General. When then-Chairman Devin Nunes produced a memorandum outlining potential abuses in the FISA warrant process regarding Carter Page, Schiff responded with a countering memo that vigorously defended the FBI's conduct and dismissed the Republican concerns as a distortion of facts. At the time, the media consensus overwhelmingly sided with Schiff, portraying the Nunes memo as a dangerous partisan stunt intended to obstruct justice. However, the subsequent release of Inspector General Michael Horowitz's report provided a forensic accounting that largely vindicated the concerns raised by Nunes and effectively dismantled the assurances given by Schiff. The censure resolution leverages this historical correction, arguing that Schiff's memo was not a good faith error but a calculated effort to conceal the rot within the warrant application process. We must analyze the specific implications of the FISA abuses that Schiff is accused of covering up, as they strike at the heart of the Fourth Amendment and the balance between liberty and security. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was created to oversee the government's power to spy on foreign agents, a power so invasive that it requires a distinct, secret judicial process to administer. When officials omit exculpatory evidence or rely on tainted sources like the Steele dossier to obtain a warrant against a US citizen, they are not just breaking procedural rules, they are weaponizing the state's surveillance apparatus against domestic political opponents. Hageman and Luna contend that by defending these defective warrants, Schiff aligned himself with a surveillance state that had slipped its leash. This argument frames the censure not just as a punishment for lying, but as a defense of civil liberties against an oversight chairman who acted more like a prosecutor than a guardian of the Constitution. The concept of asymmetric information is central to understanding the leverage Schiff possessed and allegedly abused during the height of the Russia investigation. As chairman, he had access to raw intelligence, witness testimony, and classified briefings that were completely inaccessible to the press, the public, and even most other members of Congress. This information gap allowed him to make assertions about direct evidence of collusion that could not be fact-checked in real time, creating a reality where his word was the only available currency. The representatives argue that Schiff exploited this monopoly on information to manipulate the national discourse, knowing that the slow gears of declassification would not catch up to his soundbites for years. By the time the transcripts were released and the lack of smoking gun evidence became apparent, the political damage had already been inflicted and the news cycle had moved on. A particularly contentious episode cited by the censure proponents involved Schiff's opening statement during a hearing on the burgeoning Ukraine scandal, where he improvised a dialogue that he later characterized as a parody of the call between President Trump and President Zelensky. To his critics, and specifically to the sponsors of the censure, this was not a moment of theatrical license but a deliberate attempt to rewrite the official record for the television audience. They argue that by fabricating quotes and attributing them to the president in an official congressional hearing, Schiff abandoned the decorum and truthfulness required of his station. This incident is presented as a microcosm of his broader approach, prioritizing the effectiveness of the narrative over the accuracy of the record. From a neutral standpoint, while political speech often employs hyperbole, the fabrication of a conversation during an impeachment-related hearing blurs the line between rhetoric and disinformation in a way that institutionalists find deeply troubling. The transcripts released in May 2020 from the House Intelligence Committee's closed-door interviews provide the evidentiary backbone for the claim that Schiff misled the public. These documents revealed that while Schiff was publicly intimating that conclusive evidence of collusion existed, top Obama-era officials, including James Clapper and others, were testifying under oath that they had seen no direct evidence of a conspiracy. The dissonance between the confident public projections of guilt and the cautious private admissions of uncertainty is the network of lies to which Hageman and Luna refer. They argue that Schiff knew the cupboard was bare regarding criminal conspiracy, yet continued to promise the American people that a bombshell was imminent. This behavior, they assert, kept the country in a state of suspended agitation and effectively paralyzed the executive branch's ability to conduct foreign policy with Russia. The role of the media in this ecosystem cannot be overstated, and the censure resolution implicitly indicts the symbiotic relationship between Schiff and the press corps. For years, the former chairman was a ubiquitous presence on cable news, where his assertions were frequently treated as breaking news rather than partisan commentary. The representatives argue that this uncritical amplification created a feedback loop where the Russia hoax became a self-sustaining industry, driving ratings for networks and political capital for Schiff. By censuring him, the House is also delivering a rebuke to the media environment that allowed these claims to go unchallenged for so long. It suggests that the oversight function of the press failed, relying too heavily on the credentials of the source rather than demanding the evidence behind the claims. Furthermore, the financial argument regarding the $32 million extends beyond the direct cost of the Mueller investigation to the hidden costs of legislative paralysis. Hageman and Luna contend that the years spent chasing the Russia narrative were years where the Intelligence Committee was distracted from genuine threats rising from China, Iran, and legitimate terrorist networks. They argue that the obsession with domestic political targets compromised the committee's primary mission of anticipating foreign dangers. In this view, Schiff's leadership created a strategic blind spot, as the resources and attention of the nation's premier intelligence oversight body were directed inward rather than outward. This is a severe charge of dereliction of duty, framing the political crusade as a national security vulnerability in its own right. The emotional resonance of the censure motion stems from the deep sense of betrayal felt by voters who believe the narrative, only to see it evaporate upon the release of the Mueller report. For nearly 2 years, a significant portion of the electorate was convinced that their president was a foreign asset, a belief instilled and nurtured by the statements of the Intelligence Committee chairman. When the special counsel concluded his work without establishing a criminal conspiracy, the whiplash created a profound cynicism toward government institutions. Hageman and Luna argue that Schiff is personally responsible for this degradation of public trust. They posit that you cannot simply walk away from years of accusing a sitting president of treason without facing consequences when the evidence fails to materialize. From a procedural perspective, the censure is a rare and distinct form of punishment, one step below expulsion but far more severe than a simple reprimand. It requires the offending member to stand in the well of the House while the Speaker reads the resolution aloud, a public shaming designed to be entered into the permanent history of the Congress. By pursuing this specific remedy, the Republican majority is signaling that they view Schiff's conduct as historically aberrant, requiring a sanction that will follow him for the rest of his career. It is a declaration that the normal rules of partisan combat were violated, and that the institution must draw a line in the sand to prevent the Intelligence Committee from ever again being used as a partisan cudgel. Their accountability demanded by the resolution also serves a deterrent function, warning future committee chairs that the weaponization of their gavel comes with personal risk. In the rough-and-tumble world of Washington, political actors often assume that they are immune from retrospective judgment as long as they remain in power. This censure challenges that assumption, establishing a precedent that the majority can and will police the past conduct of its members, particularly regarding the handling of classified intelligence. It introduces a new variable into the calculus of congressional leadership: the possibility that today's political strategy could become tomorrow's grounds for formal condemnation. The intersection of the Durham report with the censure resolution provides the final layer of forensic validation for Hageman and Luna's arguments. Special counsel John Durham's investigation into the origins of the FBI's probe concluded that the Bureau lacked actual evidence of collusion when it launched the investigation, and that it relied too heavily on political opposition research. While Schiff was not the subject of Durham's probe, the report's findings dismantled the foundational premise of the investigation Schiff championed. The representatives used Durham's conclusions as the objective truth against which Schiff's past statements are measured and found wanting. It allows them to argue that their grievances are not based on partisan opinion, but on the finalized conclusions of the Department of Justice itself. We must also consider the counterarguments regarding the precedent this sets for the speech and debate clause, which generally protects members of Congress from being questioned in any other place for speech on the House floor. However, the House has the constitutional right to punish its own members for disorderly behavior. The proponents of the censure argue that lying to the American public about national security matters constitutes disorderly behavior that brings disrepute upon the House. They are effectively carving out an exception to the tradition of unbridled speech, suggesting that when that speech involves the unique authority of the Intelligence Committee, the standard for truthfulness must be absolute. This is a high-stakes constitutional argument that redefines the boundaries of acceptable political rhetoric. Ultimately, Part 2 of this analysis reveals that the censure of Adam Schiff is not merely about a single politician. It is a proxy war over the history of the Trump administration and the integrity of the deep state institutions. The lie alleged by Hageman and Luna is multifaceted. It is the Steele dossier, the FISA warrants, the leaked insinuations, and the false certainty of collusion. By weaving these disparate elements into a single narrative of deception, they are attempting to construct a comprehensive indictment of the entire era. The censure is the vehicle through which they hope to purge the record, asserting that the chaos of those years was not the fault of the man in the Oval Office, but of the men in the shadows who sought to remove him. To understand the full structural weight of the censure resolution against Adam Schiff, we must pivot our analytical lens to the transformation of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, or HPSCI, during his tenure. Historically, this committee was regarded as a sanctuary of bipartisanship, a crown jewel of the legislature where the usual acrimony of party politics stopped at the water's edge in deference to national security. Members were often chosen for their discretion and seriousness, operating in a closed world where the shared burden of state secrets forged a unique camaraderie. However, the events detailed by Representatives Hageman and Luna describe a complete collapse of this tradition, arguing that under Schiff's gavel, the HPSCI was repurposed into a partisan war room. This shift is critical because it represents an institutional tragedy, the weaponization of the one committee designed to remain above the fray. The censure, therefore, is not just an indictment of a man, but a lament for the loss of a functioning oversight body that once operated on consensus rather than conflict. The specific controversy surrounding the whistleblower, who triggered the first impeachment of Donald Trump, serves as a pivotal chapter in the argument for Schiff's dishonesty. At the time, Schiff stated publicly during a televised interview that his committee had not spoken to the whistleblower prior to the filing of the official complaint. This assertion was later contradicted by reports revealing that the whistleblower had, in fact, approached Schiff staff for guidance before submitting the complaint to the Inspector General. While Schiff later clarified that he personally had not met the individual, his initial blanket denial is cited by Hageman and Luna as a quintessential example of deceptive framing. To the objective analyst, this distinction between I and my committee may seem like a splitting of hairs, but in the high-stakes arena of impeachment, Such precision is the difference between transparency and obfuscation. The representatives argue that by concealing this early contact, Schiff created a false appearance of an organic, independent complaint when, in reality, his office had a hand in shepherding it into existence. This procedural maneuvering speaks to a broader strategy of managing the narrative that defined the Schiff era of the Intelligence Committee. By obscuring the timeline of the whistleblower's contact, the committee leadership was able to present the complaint as a shocking, unprompted revelation that caught them by surprise, thereby maximizing its political impact. Hageman and Luna contend that this was a calculated deception designed to manipulate the media cycle and the public's perception of the impeachment's origins. It suggests a level of coordination between the oversight body and the accusers that undermines the claim of impartial investigation. In the eyes of the censure's proponents, a committee chairman who secretly guides a witness to the starting line cannot then claim to be the neutral arbiter of the race. This incident is woven into the network of lies narrative, serving as proof that the investigation was rigged from the moment of conception. The accusation of leaking classified information introduces a darker and more legally perilous element to the censure resolution. While proving the source of a leak in Washington is notoriously difficult, Hageman and Luna point to the steady drip of anti-Trump stories attributed to intelligence officials or committee sources that coincided with Schiff's tenure. These leaks often painted a picture of a presidency in chaos or compromised by foreign powers, narratives that were not always supported by the underlying intelligence products. The representatives argue that Schiff oversaw a regime where selective disclosure was used as a political weapon, releasing fragments of information that were damaging to the president while withholding exculpatory context. This selective transparency is described as a violation of the sacred oath to protect sources and methods, sacrificing national security protocols for the sake of a daily headline. We must also analyze the psychological and political dynamic of the Schiff versus Trump rivalry, which became one of the defining antagonisms of the 45th presidency. Schiff effectively positioned himself as a shadow president, using the moral authority of the Intelligence Committee to challenge the White House on matters of foreign policy and national loyalty. This was not standard oversight. It was a contest for legitimacy. By constantly questioning the president's allegiance to the United States, implying that Trump was beholden to Vladimir Putin, Schiff struck at the very foundation of the executive branch's authority. Hageman and Luna argue that this was a seditious abuse of power, an attempt to undo the results of the 2016 election by rendering the winner illegitimate in the eyes of the world. The censure is thus framed as the inevitable backlash to this overreach, a reassertion of the principle that no committee chairman has the right to essentially nullify the presidency through innuendo. The rhetoric employed by Hageman regarding the fabrication of evidence forces us to re-examine the famous parody reading of the Trump-Zelensky call transcript. Schiff defended his dramatic interpretation as an attempt to capture the essence of the president's shakedown, but to his critics, it was a blatant rewriting of history. In a court of law, summarizing a defendant's words with invented dialogue would be grounds for a mistrial. In the court of public opinion, it created confusion about what was actually said. The censure proponents argue that millions of Americans who watched that hearing believe they were hearing a verbatim account, not a theatrical monologue. From a neutral perspective, this choice by Schiff was a tactical error of significant magnitude, as it provided his opponents with irrefutable video evidence that he was willing to alter reality to suit his narrative. It stripped the impeachment proceedings of their solemnity and allowed the defense to characterize the entire process as a scripted show trial. The waste of resources argument is further bolstered by the opportunity cost of the legislative calendar. During the years consumed by the Russia investigation and the subsequent impeachment, the House of Representatives was effectively gridlocked on major legislative initiatives. The singular focus on investigating the executive branch meant that issues such as immigration reform, infrastructure investment, and healthcare costs were relegated to the background. Hageman and Luna are tapping into a vein of voter frustration that views Congress as a body that talks much but achieves little. They argue that Schiff hijacked the legislative agenda for a personal vendetta, holding the nation's business hostage while he chased conspiracy theories. This framing appeals to the pragmatic voter who judges their representatives by tangible results rather than televised hearings. Furthermore, the censure resolution acts as a forensic audit of the collusion claims, demanding a line-by-line accounting of what was promised versus what was delivered. Schiff frequently appeared on Sunday news programs promising that the evidence of collusion was in plain sight and compelling. Yet, the Mueller report, while outlining instances of potential obstruction, explicitly stated it did not establish that the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. The chasm between compelling evidence in plain sight and did not establish conspiracy is the space where the censure lives. Hageman and Luna argue that a discrepancy of this magnitude cannot be dismissed as a difference of interpretation. It must be labeled as a lie. They contend that Schiff, having seen the classified evidence, knew that the smoking gun did not exist but continued to bluff the American public to keep the investigation alive. The concept of restoring dignity to the House is a central theme in the closing arguments of the censure proponents. They posit that the reputation of the entire legislative branch has been tarnished by the antics of the Intelligence Committee. In their view, the House cannot demand the respect of the people or the cooperation of the executive branch if it allows its own leaders to traffic in falsehoods without consequence. The censure is presented as a self-correcting mechanism, a way for the institution to say, "This behavior does not represent us." It is an attempt to separate the institution of the House from the actions of Adam Schiff, quarantining the damage he caused to his own reputation rather than allowing it to infect the entire body. This is a crucial distinction for institutionalists who want to preserve the credibility of congressional oversight for future administrations. We must also consider the strategic implications of the censure for the Democratic Party. By forcing a vote on Schiff's conduct, the Republicans are compelling every Democrat to go on the record either defending his actions or implicitly condemning them. In a polarized environment, most Democrats will rally around Schiff, viewing the censure as a badge of honor and a partisan attack. However, for moderate Democrats in swing districts, this vote presents a dilemma. Defending a colleague who was proven wrong by the Mueller report and the Inspector General can be a liability in a general election. Hageman and Luna are aware of this political calculus. The censure is designed to be a wedge issue that forces the opposition to defend the indefensible, thereby tying the entire party to the failed narratives of the past. The role of the deep state or the permanent bureaucracy is inextricably linked to the censure narrative, though often implicitly. Schiff is portrayed not as a rogue actor, but as the congressional avatar of a bureaucratic establishment that sought to undermine a disruptive president. His defense of the FBI's FISA applications and his reliance on intelligence leaks suggest a symbiotic alliance with the unelected power centers in Washington. The censure, therefore, is also a rebuke of this alliance. It signals that the elected representatives of the people, the House majority, are asserting their supremacy over the unelected intelligence apparatus and its congressional protectors. It is a assertion of democratic control over the security state that Schiff championed. The specific language used by Luna, describing Schiff as a domestic threat to the integrity of the government, escalates the rhetoric to a level rarely seen in congressional proceedings. This is not merely calling him a liar, it is framing him as a danger to the Republic. This intensity reflects the deep-seated belief among the MAGA constituency that the actions taken during the Trump years were not just politics as usual, but a form of soft coup. By using such charged language, Luna is validating the anger of millions of voters who feel that their Democratic choice in 2016 was sabotaged by a cabal of insiders. The censure is the parliamentary expression of this outrage, a formal acknowledgement that the system was weaponized against the will of the people. In analyzing the legal precedents, it is important to note that while the Constitution grants the House broad powers to discipline its members, censure is a tool that has been used sparingly, typically for financial misconduct or sexual impropriety. Using it to punish political speech and legislative conduct creates a new paradigm. Schiff's defenders argue that he was simply doing his job as an aggressive prosecutor of executive misconduct, and that his statements were protected political opinions. However, the counterargument presented by Hageman and Luna is that there is a distinction between aggressive oversight and malicious fabrication. They argue that when the chairman of the Intelligence Committee speaks, he is presumed to be speaking from a position of factual authority, not political opinion. When that authority is abused to mislead the nation on grave matters of national security, the political speech defense evaporates. Finally, the moral obligation to censure Schiff is framed as a duty to history. The proponents argue that if this chapter of American history is to be written accurately, the official record must reflect that the collusion narrative was false and that its primary architect was formally condemned. Without this censure, they fear that future generations might look back and see the uncorrected record of Schiff's accusations as fact. The vote is an attempt to place an asterisk next to the Schiff era of the Intelligence Committee, a permanent footnote warning that the statements made during this time were found to be untruthful by a majority of the House. It is a battle for the memory of the nation, ensuring that the Russia hoax is remembered as a cautionary tale of political excess rather than a legitimate inquiry. The introduction of the Durham Report into the legislative record serves as the empirical anchor for the censure resolution, providing a government-stamped validation for what were previously dismissed as partisan talking points. For years, the debate over the origins of the Russia investigation was a matter of he said, she said, with Schiff's narrative holding the institutional high ground due to his chairmanship. However, Special Counsel John Durham's rigorous exhaustion of the facts concluded that the FBI failed to uphold its mission of strict fidelity to the law, effectively dismantling the premise that the investigation was predicated on solid intelligence. Hageman and Luna utilized this report not just as evidence, but as a weapon of retrospection, arguing that every defense Schiff mounted for the FBI was, in fact, a defense of malpractice. From a neutral analytical standpoint, the existence of the Durham Report transforms the censure from a political vendetta into a procedural reckoning based on the Department of Justice's own findings. It strips away the ambiguity that Schiff relied upon, leaving a stark contrast between his public confidence and the private reality of a crumbling case. We must critically examine the specific allegation that Schiff's rhetoric ripped the country apart, a charge that moves beyond legalities into the realm of sociology and national cohesion. The representatives argue that the constant drumbeat of treason allegations against a sitting president created a psychological environment of instability, leading half the country to believe their government had been hijacked by a foreign power. This was not merely a policy disagreement. It was an existential crisis manufactured, according to the censure proponents, for political gain. They contend that the social fabric of the United States was frayed by a narrative that turned neighbors against neighbors and delegitimized the democratic process itself. By holding Schiff accountable, the House is attempting to acknowledge the trauma inflicted on the electorate by this era of heightened paranoia. It is an assertion that the cost of political warfare cannot include the disintegration of shared national reality. The financial dimension of the censure, specifically the reference to the $32 million, operates as a potent populist hook that translates abstract intelligence abuses into a theft of public resources. In the calculus of Hageman and Luna, this money was not spent on justice, but was effectively embezzled to fund a political opposition campaign under the guise of a special counsel. They argue that every dollar spent by the Mueller team was a dollar diverted from the needs of the American taxpayer, spurned on a wild goose chase that Schiff knew was baseless. This argument resonates deeply in a time of economic uncertainty, framing the investigation as a symbol of Washington's disconnect from the fiscal realities of the citizenry. It suggests that there should be a fiduciary penalty for political malpractice, or at least a formal acknowledgement that the public treasury was raided to settle a partisan score. The censure also brings into sharp focus the symbiotic relationship between the Intelligence Committee and the intelligence agencies it is sworn to oversee. Traditionally, the committee acts as a watchdog, barking when the agencies overstep their bounds or violate the civil liberties of Americans. Hageman and Luna argue that under Schiff, this dynamic was inverted. The watchdog became the lapdog, shielding the FBI and the CIA from legitimate criticism in exchange for leaks and political ammunition. This alignment, they contend, represents a dangerous consolidation of power where the legislative check on the executive's surveillance capabilities is nullified by partisan interests. From an institutional perspective, this is perhaps the most damaging charge, that the oversight mechanism itself was captured, leaving the intelligence community free to operate without accountability as long as they served the chairman's political goals. The controversy regarding the Danchenko subsource highlights the technical granularity of the deception alleged in the resolution. The Steele dossier relied heavily on a primary subsource, Igor Danchenko, whose credibility was rapidly disintegrating inside the FBI even as the investigation ramped up. The representatives argue that Schiff, having access to the classified assessments of these sources, was aware that the foundation of the collusion narrative was collapsing in real time. Yet, instead of alerting the public or halting the investigation, he doubled down, protecting the dossier's legitimacy in the public eye. This is described as a lie by omission of the highest order, where the silence regarding the source's unreliability was just as damning as the vocal accusations of treason. It paints a picture of a chairman who prioritized the maintenance of the narrative over the integrity of the intelligence product. We must also consider the chilling effect argument often raised by Schiff's defenders, and how Hageman and Luna deconstruct it within the context of the censure. The defense posits that punishing a committee chairman for aggressive oversight will discourage future investigations and weaken the legislative branch. However, the proponents of the censure counter that there is a fundamental difference between aggressive oversight and the fabrication of evidence. They argue that the true chill on democracy comes from allowing a powerful chairman to mislead the public with impunity, thereby discouraging voters from trusting their government. In their view, the censure restores the proper boundaries of oversight by establishing that truthfulness is a prerequisite for the power to investigate. It sends a message that the gavel is not a license to lie, but a responsibility to illuminate the truth. The role of media complicity is an unwritten but palpable subtext of the entire censure proceeding. Hageman and Luna are not just indicting Schiff. They are implicitly indicting the entire media ecosystem that awarded him accolades and airtime for claims that ultimately prove hollow. The censure serves as a formal correction to the Pulitzer Prize narrative that dominated the press during the Trump years, placing a congressional stamp of disapproval on the reporting of that era. It is a vindication for the alternative media and the skeptical voices that were marginalized or banned for questioning the collusion story. By formally condemning the source of those stories, the House is validating the skepticism of the conservative base and challenging the mainstream media to retract their coverage. It is a battle over who gets to write the first draft of history. The invocation of the FISA Court's rebuke strengthens the objective basis for the censure, moving the argument beyond partisan interpretation to judicial fact. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court itself later declared that several of the warrants against Carter Page were invalid, a rare and humiliating admission for the DOJ. Hageman and Luna point out that while the court was discovering these grave errors, Schiff was publicly assuring the nation that the process was rigorous and the evidence overwhelmed. This disconnect places Schiff in direct opposition to the judicial branch's own findings. The representatives argue that a congressman cannot claim to be a defender of the rule of law while actively defending warrants that the court itself has deemed illegal. This aligns the censure motion with the judiciary, presenting the House Republicans as the defenders of the court's integrity against a rogue chairman. The moral obligation rhetoric used by the representatives elevates the censure to a matter of conscience, framing the vote as a test of personal integrity for every member of the House. They argue that to vote against the censure is to become an accessory to the deception, retroactively endorsing the lies that were told. This binary framing is designed to squeeze moderate members, forcing them to choose between party loyalty and the uncomfortable facts of the Durham report. It suggests that there is no middle ground. Either you condemn the fabrication of the Russia collusion narrative, or you own it. This strategy effectively nationalizes the vote, making it a potential campaign issue in districts where the Russia hoax is seen as a symbol of Washington corruption. Furthermore, the censure resolution addresses the damage to the presidency not as a personal grievance of Donald Trump, but as an institutional injury to the executive branch. Hageman and Luna argue that by launching baseless investigations, Schiff hobbled the administration's ability to conduct foreign policy, particularly with nuclear-armed adversaries. The constant cloud of treason made diplomatic engagement with Russia politically toxic, potentially exacerbating geopolitical tensions. From a neutral geopolitical analysis, it is undeniable that the domestic political turmoil constrained the administration's options on the world stage. The representatives contend that Schiff sacrificed the national interest and potentially global stability for the sake of a domestic political strategy. This charge of placing party over country is the ultimate betrayal referenced in their speeches. The precedent of retaliation is a factor that looms over these proceedings, with analysts questioning whether this censure opens the floodgates for future partisan retribution. However, Hageman and Luna argue that this case is sui generis, unique in its scope and damage, and therefore warrants a unique remedy. They contend that never before has a desperate political operation utilized the intelligence apparatus so brazenly to frame a president. By distinguishing Schiff's conduct as historically aberrant, they attempt to insulate their actions from the charge of starting a tit-for-tat war. They frame the censure not as the new normal, but as a necessary emergency measure to cauterize a wound that has festered for 6 years. It is presented as a singular punishment for a singular crime against the Republic. The focus on accountability also touches on the concept of elite impunity, the idea that powerful figures in Washington rarely face consequences for their failures. Hageman and Luna are tapping into a populist vein that demands equal justice, arguing that if a regular citizen lied to the FBI or the courts, they would face prison time. While the House cannot imprison Schiff, the censure is the closest equivalent to a criminal conviction in the legislative context. It strips away the veneer of respectability and marks him as a delinquent actor. The representatives argue that this symbolic punishment is the bare minimum required to show the American people that there is not a two-tiered system of justice where politicians are exempt from the rules of honesty. We must also analyze the specific breach of protocol regarding the release of the Schiff memo. The representatives argue that this document was not just a difference of opinion. It was a deliberate counterintelligence operation designed to muddy the waters. By releasing a memo that contained factual inaccuracies and omissions to counter the accurate Nunes memo, Schiff utilized the fog of war to confuse the public. Hageman and Luna contend that this was a cynical exploitation of the complexity of intelligence work. They argue that Schiff banked on the fact that the average voter would not understand the intricacies of FISA warrants, allowing him to prevail through sheer confidence and authority. The censure is an attempt to pierce that fog and clarify the record once and for all. The betrayal of the Constitution charge is the crescendo of the argument, linking the specific actions of Schiff to the foundational document of the nation. Hageman and Luna argue that the Constitution envisions a government of checks and balances, not a government of saboteurs. By using the Intelligence Committee to undermine the duly elected president, they claim Schiff violated the separation of powers and the will of the electorate. This argument positions the censure as a defense of the constitutional order itself, rather than a mere partisan squabble. It appeals to the high-minded principles of the Republic, suggesting that the survival of democratic governance depends on the expulsion of dishonesty from the halls of power. Ultimately, Part 4 of this analysis illuminates the censure of Adam Schiff as a multidimensional conflict involving legal, financial, and ethical battlegrounds. It is a proxy war for the legitimacy of the entire Trump era. Hageman and Luna are not just asking for a reprimand. They are asking the House to officially certify that the resistance was built on a foundation of falsehoods. The censure is the legislative mechanism to formally declare the Russia collusion narrative dead and to pin the coroner's tag on Adam Schiff. It is a final attempt to close the book on a divisive chapter of American history by naming and shaming the author of the discord. The culmination of the legislative effort to censure Adam Schiff represents a historic watershed in the annals of the House of Representatives, marking the moment when the accumulated grievances of the past 6 years were crystallized into a formal institutional judgment. When the gavel finally fell, confirming the censure, it was not merely a procedural victory for Representatives Hageman and Luna, but a symbolic closing of the circle regarding the Russia investigation. The image of a former committee chairman being summoned to the well of the House to be publicly admonished is a visual of immense political power, serving as a permanent scar on a legislative career. This specific disciplinary action is designed to be indelible. Unlike a media cycle that fades or a tweet that is deleted, a censure resolution is entered into the official journal of the House, ensuring that future historians researching the Trump era will encounter this formal condemnation alongside the narratives of collusion. Hageman and Luna argued effectively that this permanence was the only appropriate remedy for a deception that had become so deeply embedded in the national consciousness. They contended that without such a definitive rebuke, the historical record would remain ambiguous, allowing the network of lies to persist as a contested truth rather than being marked as a verified falsehood. The financial framing of the censure, specifically the invocation of the $32 million, serves as the ultimate fiduciary indictment of Schiff's tenure. In the final analysis, this figure represents the tangible cost of the hysteria that the representatives claim Schiff engineered. By attaching a dollar amount to the political theater, they stripped the investigation of its noble veneer and presented it as a gross mismanagement of public funds. The argument posits that Schiff, in his zeal to destroy a political opponent, acted with reckless disregard for the taxpayer, treating the federal treasury as a campaign war chest. This perspective shifts the debate from a complex discussion of counterintelligence protocols to a simple, visceral matter of theft. It suggests that the American people were defrauded, forced to pay for an investigation that the proponents argue was known to be baseless from the start. This fraud against the taxpayer narrative is a powerful closing argument because it transcends partisan lines. Even voters indifferent to the personality of Donald Trump can find common ground in the objection to government waste. We must also consider the restoration of standards that this censure attempts to codify for future intelligence oversight. The Intelligence Committee is unique in that its members are custodians of the nation's deepest secrets, a role that requires a suspension of the usual partisan disbelief. Hageman and Luna argued that Schiff shattered this unique compact, replacing the solemn duty of silence with the opportunistic clamor of the cable news circuit. The censure is thus a regulatory measure, a warning to future chairmen that the privileges of the SCIF are not transferable to the television studio. It establishes a new precedent, that the weaponization of classified innuendo is a punishable offense. This serves as an attempt to depoliticize the intelligence apparatus by raising the cost of abuse. From a neutral institutional perspective, this is a significant development, as it signals that the House is willing to police the boundaries between oversight and operation, asserting that even the most powerful committee heads are subject to the judgment of the whole body. The moral obligation to hold Schiff accountable is further illuminated by the contrast between his public certainty and the private doubts of the intelligence community. The censure resolution highlights the specific betrayal of the duty to inform. The electorate relies on the Intelligence Committee to be the honest broker of threats facing the nation. When the chairman looks into the camera and claims to have evidence of a conspiracy, the public has no choice but to believe him, as they cannot access the raw data. Hageman and Luna contend that Schiff abused this vulnerability, exploiting the public's trust to sell a narrative that he knew was hollow. The censure is described as a necessary corrective to this information asymmetry, a declaration that the House will not tolerate its leaders gaslighting the population. It frames the vote as a defense of the truth itself, asserting that in a democracy, the government cannot be allowed to manufacture its own reality to manipulate the voters. Furthermore, the chilling effect on future political warfare cannot be overstated. By successfully censuring a figure as prominent as Adam Schiff, the Republican majority has demonstrated that they have both the will and the tactical acumen to exact a price for what they view as past transgressions. This shatters the unwritten rule of Washington that protects senior leadership from the consequences of their failed strategies. The representatives argue that this accountability is essential for the health of the Republic, that without consequences, there is no learning, and without learning, the abuses will be repeated. The censure serves as a circuit breaker, interrupting the cycle of impunity that has allowed the Russia hoax to fester for so long. It forces the political class to pause and recalculate the risks of engaging in high-stakes narrative warfare involving national security assets. The interplay between the censure and the deep state narrative provides the final structural pillar of the argument. Hageman and Luna position Schiff not just as a politician, but as the legislative frontman for a bureaucratic resistance that sought to undo the 2016 election. His defense of the FBI's flawed FISA warrants, his reliance on leaks from anonymous officials, and his coordination with the whistleblower are all cited as evidence of his integration into this shadow government. The censure, therefore, is a rebuke of the entire ecosystem of UN-elected power that aligned itself against the Trump administration. It is a assertion of democratic supremacy, a reminder that the bureaucracy answers to the elected representatives, and that those representatives answer to the people. By punishing Schiff, the House is symbolically reigning in the intelligence agencies he protected, signaling that the era of unquestioned deference to the security state is over. The divisiveness of the censure vote itself is a point of contention, yet Hageman and Luna argue that true unity can only be achieved through truth. They contend that the country cannot heal from the trauma of the Russia investigation until the lie is fully exposed and the liar is punished. In their view, the division was caused by the deception, not by the effort to correct it. They frame the censure not as an act of revenge, but as an act of reconciliation with reality. By forcing the House to go on the record, they are demanding that the institution choose between continuing the charade or facing the uncomfortable facts of the Durham report. This argument appeals to the desire for closure, suggesting that the only way to move forward is to surgically remove the source of the infection. The specific betrayal of the Constitution charge regarding the abuse of the FISA process is the legal bedrock upon which the moral arguments rest. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures, a protection that was violated when the FBI, with Schiff's political cover, obtained warrants based on the fraudulent Steele dossier. Hageman and Luna argue that Schiff's defense of these warrants was a dereliction of his oath to support and defend the Constitution. They posit that an intelligence chairman who champions the violation of civil liberties for political gain has forfeited his right to lead. The censure is presented as the House's defense of the Bill of Rights, a declaration that the end, investigating a president, does not justify the means, trampling on the constitutional rights of American citizens. Moreover, the waste of $32 million is reframed in the closing arguments as a theft of opportunity. It is not just the cash, it is the time, the focus, and the energy of the nation that was squandered. The representatives argue that for 2 years, the oxygen was sucked out of the room by a phantom scandal, leaving real problems to fester. They paint a picture of a Congress paralyzed by Schiff's obsessions, unable to address the border, the economy, or the rise of China because they were too busy chasing Russian ghosts. The censure is a condemnation of this strategic negligence, a formal statement that the House failed the American people by allowing itself to be distracted by a fabrication. It is a demand for a return to serious governance, where the priorities of the legislature align with the needs of the citizenry rather than the vendettas of the leadership. The emotional resonance of the betrayal of trust argument is the final hook that connects the censure to the average voter. Hageman and Luna speak to the millions of Americans who felt disenfranchised and insulted by the implication that their president was a traitor. They argue that Schiff insulted the intelligence of the American voter, treating them as pawns in a geopolitical game. The censure is a vindication for these voters, a validation of their skepticism and a recognition of their frustration. It sends a message that their voices have finally been heard and that the establishment is being forced to answer for its arrogance. This populist undercurrent transforms the censure from a dry parliamentary procedure into a moment of catharsis for a significant portion of the electorate. In analyzing the long-term implications, we must recognize that this censure sets a new standard of verification for public statements by committee chairs. Hageman and Luna have effectively established that "I have seen the intelligence" is no longer a sufficient defense for making explosive claims. The censure demands that such claims be backed by verifiable evidence, or else the Speaker risks formal condemnation. This shift toward evidence-based oversight is a direct repudiation of the Schiff standard, which relied on the authority of the position rather than the substance of the proof. It pushes the House toward a more transparent mode of operation, where the "trust me" approach to national security is replaced by a "show me" requirement. The final verdict on Adam Schiff, delivered through the censure, is that he misled the American people. This simple, devastating phrase captures the essence of the resolution. It is not a charge of incompetence or error, but of active deception. Hageman and Luna successfully argued that the discrepancy between the classified reality and the public narrative was too vast to be accidental. They made the case that it was a deliberate strategy, executed with precision and maintained with discipline, until the weight of the truth finally caused it to collapse. The censure is the official acknowledgement of this collapse, the final punctuation mark on a sentence that began with the Steele dossier and ended with the Durham report. As the House moves forward from this vote, the shadow of the censure will linger over the Intelligence Committee. The precedent has been set that the gavel is a loan from the people, not a permanent possession, and that it can be revoked or tarnished if abused. Representatives Hageman and Luna, through their advocacy, have rewritten the rules of engagement for congressional oversight. They have demonstrated that the speech and debate clause is not a shield for dishonesty, and that the political consequences of lying to the public can be severe. The censure of Adam Schiff stands as a monument to the fierce battle for truth in the information age, a permanent reminder that in the end, the facts will always have the final say. The $32 million wasted, the FISA abuses, the false narratives of collusion, all of these elements are now bound together in the history books under the heading of this censure. It is a comprehensive rejection of the methods and the madness that defined the era. By taking this step, the House of Representatives has attempted to wash its hands of the deception, placing the blame squarely on the shoulders of the man who led the charge. It is a harsh, necessary, and historic judgment, one that asserts that the integrity of the American government is worth more than the career of any single politician. The story of the Russia investigation effectively ends here, not with a bang of a gavel on a conviction, but with the quiet, crushing weight of a censure resolution that declares, once and for all, that the American people were lied to, and that the House of Representatives will no longer abide it.